I'm very happy to report that we have the ninth Earl Spencer, Charles Spencer, who is an author, a historian. He's also been in the news business like me. He's been a journalist, and he is the author of the newly released in the U.S. market, The White Ship, Conquest, Anarchy, and the Wrecking of Henry I's Dream. Now, I didn't know what I was getting into. By the way, I'm Steve Clemons. I'm editor-at-large of The Hill, but I didn't know what I was getting into when we agreed to do this. And I have just found this book absolutely riveting. I know that Charles has described it as sort of a hybrid of the Titanic meets Game of Thrones. I'm not sure I would put it like that because I think it's better than both of those metaphors put together. And I think it's an absolutely intriguing story. So I would just like to say, first of all, welcome, Earl Spencer. Charles, it's terrific to have you with us for this launch of your important book that goes back to 1120, folks. I mean, this is what, 900 years ago, somewhat nearly 1,000 years ago. And I woke up this morning after having read it saying, I'm so happy that I wasn't born a 12th century prince. But let's talk about that for a moment. Charles, could you sort of tell us what led you to this incredible story? And can you lay the scaffolding of this incident for us? And then we'll go from there.
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, Steve, for having me and everyone who's come to join you. But this has been a passion of mine, history since I was a small boy. I'm 57. I was probably the last generation of English people to be brought up on a strict and very varied diet of history. It was a compulsory subject when I was growing up. The first book I can remember being made to read is an incredibly old-fashioned history book called Our Island Story. It was about how wonderful Britain was from the time of the Romans till Queen Victoria. I mean, it sounds very quaint now. And essentially, there was a chapter on Henry I, who is one of Britain's greatest monarchs, although he's rather off the radar these days. And I remember being so intrigued about the story of the White Ship, the name of the book, because that was the central tenet of the chapter on Henry I. And I think what really intrigued me was the scale of the drama. It was a dynastic changing catastrophe, but at the same time, it had a very human element to it. It was still people's lives being lost in the worst maritime disaster that Britain's ever suffered, even to this day. And I then was actually, the Americans have a role in me writing this book because I was asked to give a keynote speech to an audience of American historians who were traveling Britain about 6 years ago at Leeds Castle, one of our more beautiful castles. And I gave a talk on the Queens of England. And they knew rather more than I did about Victoria and Elizabeth and Anne Boleyn, etc. But they didn't know much about the woman who should have become queen when the White Ship went down. And I remember recognizing in the audience a moment of interest in my talk. And then I spotted the 900th anniversary was coming up last year, and I wrote the book about it. And the reason it's such a significant tale, I'm not talking about my book, I'm talking about this historic moment, was that if I can hang our hat, all of us collectively, on 1066 as a date when William the Conqueror took England, this was the moment that saw his dynasty off. Because essentially, Henry I is the hero of my book. He's the fourth and youngest son of William the Conqueror. The Conqueror's eldest son was a rather feeble man, charming but feeble, who was trying to rule Normandy. And the second son, William Rufus, was a sort of rather rough, sort of sexually adventurous soldier. And they both had their moments. William Rufus was killed in a hunting accident in 1100, and Robert Curthose, the eldest son, lost Normandy in a battle with this junior son, Henry I. And Henry I took the throne of England in 1100. He totally transformed the system of government here. He laid down the system of treasury, the exchequer, which still exists today. He settled so many things. And the main thing he managed to do was to beat the French. This was a rather crucial prerequisite of being a successful medieval English king. And he beat this rather wonderful adversary, a very able man who called himself Louis the Fat, and his coins prove that he wasn't exaggerating, and he beat him repeatedly in battle for one purpose. Henry I had one legitimate son. He had 22 illegitimate children, but one legitimate son. The church had taken over control at this stage, and they made it quite clear that illegitimacy ruled people out of succeeding to crowns. And so all of Henry I's hopes and his future lay on the shoulders of the one legitimate son, who's called William. And William was one of the 300 very distinguished people who got on the White Ship on the 25th of November, 1120.
Which was the grandest ship of its time, right? It was the best, prettiest, grandest ship of its time.
It was, and it was huge. It doesn't sound a lot to us. We're used to seeing these gigantic liners now, but 350 people on a ship then was massive. There were 50 oarsmen, as well as the sails, of course. And just to give you perspective, when William the Conqueror landed in England in 1066, his flagship had 16 men rowing. So this is a seriously large ship. It was the grandest one. When Henry I arrived in Barfleur, it's a harbour a little north of where Omaha Beach is in Normandy, he was greeted by this captain, the proud captain of the White Ship, who said to Henry I, "Sire, it was my father's honour to take your father, William the Conqueror, to England in 1066. And now you've had 4 years of success against the French. It's my honour, please, to take you back in the White Ship to England." Henry I was a rather sort of gruff figure. If I was casting this as a movie, he's Russell Crowe. And he had already made his arrangements. And he wasn't going to be swayed by some pushy captain trying to get him to take his fancy vessel north across the channel. And he said, "No, I'll carry on with my arrangements, but I have to admit, your ship, the White Ship, is a marvelous looking vessel. And it would be great fun for my son, several of my illegitimate children, cousins, relatives, generals, commanders, 18 of the grandest women in Anglo-Norman society. They can go on your ship." And that was the disaster. There wasn't a plan B. Henry I hadn't got another son. The son stayed in the harbour. He was 17 years old. He was being flattered by everyone around him. He was kind of like a Kardashian, right? He was a Kardashian, kind of the Kardashian of his time. He had this whole entourage, and the little bride. So folks, I've read the book, so I get so excited talking about it. But he was this superstar prince at a time when there weren't a lot of people like that, right? It was sort of the first celebrity prince. That's so true. And the chroniclers at the time, who are all quite prudish, they're all monks. They're not men of the world, but they mark him down as vain, surrounded by sort of idiots, sycophants, and they probably were. And we do know they did something very, very unwise. So they got very drunk in the harbour before setting off. And, one of the chapters I really enjoyed writing was about the medieval attitude to the sea, or the ocean. To your average person in early 12th century Europe, the sea was just a terrifying and beautiful place. You didn't know what it had in store. And most of the people of England and France at this time were sort of what I would call rabidly Christian. They looked to God for salvation and meaning in a very direct way. And so when a mighty ship was going on a voyage across this dangerous element of the water, they would call upon monks or priests to come and bless it. And the people on board the White Ship, the sycophants around the prince, were so drunk by the stage that the monks came to bless it, that they chased them off in a very sort of boorish way. And people look back on that as that was a bad decision, because that was mocking God. And then they set off. And I think the combination of being overexcited about having the prince on board, being intoxicated from the large amount of wine that they consumed, and the general raucousness of the crowd on board made the goal come to life, that they all shouted out, "Let's try and beat the king," who'd set off several hours before. He was going to get to England first. Let's try and beat him to England. So the 50 oarsmen bent their backs. The helmsman dropped the sail of the White Ship far too soon. that part of Normandy has a wonderful coast for a harbor, but you have to be careful the first mile or so outside. There are a lot of rocks. And so the combination of speed and alcohol meant that they hit this rock very hard, very early on in the voyage. It's still there, the Keyberth Rock, I've been there. And they toppled into the sea. And luckily for history, and particularly for people writing on the subject, such as myself, there was one survivor out of the 350 people on board. And he was the lowliest passenger on board.
He was the butcher.
He was the butcher. He was the butcher from Rouen, who was a bit upset seeing all these aristocratic and royal people disappearing into the distance. So he jumped on the white ship to get his debts paid and became an eyewitness to the most extraordinary carnage, actually, because it was very cold, end of November in the Channel. It was near to freezing. But I had to learn a little bit. Steve, I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a creative person, really. But I had to learn, we've all hit a swimming pool or a lake or a shower when it's taken you by surprise by how cold it is. And there is actually a reaction called cold water shock, where you go, and that's pretty bad news if you can't swim. You're going to take in a lot of water, and a lot of them drowned straight away. And then others died of hypothermia. And the butcher, Barreau the butcher from Rouen, managed to scramble onto a piece of broken mast next to one of the great fighting men of Henry's reign. But the fighting man didn't make it through the night. He died what is clearly hypothermia. He died, all the symptoms were there. And Barreau the butcher was found in the morning, afloat, just alive, on a broken mast by a fisherman. And he had the most horrific tale to tell.
Well, and William, the Kardashian of the moment, was actually saved by the King's guards, by Henry's guards, according to your account and the butcher's account, thrown into the single lifeboat they had. But then he went back for his sister, right?
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Actually, that was the element that really got me when I read about this as a boy, because I get, losing the prince is a big deal. But the prince was a young man, and above the sort of cacophony of screams and wailings and people thrashing around in the water, he heard the piercing voice of his half-sister. She was an illegitimate half-sister, the Countess of Perche. And she started by calling for help, and then she started to insult his manhood for leaving her there. And he ordered his bodyguards to turn the little boat around and go and retrieve her. And that was what sealed his fate, because there were people still alive in the water, enough to grab onto the side and be heavy enough to take it down. And actually, what I love when I write these books is I like a central drama and a central narrative. But what's so intriguing about her death was that her husband wasn't on that vessel, and nor were her young daughters. And as a way of the two little girls staying in touch with their mother after she was dead, he built a little oratory, a place of worship for them to go and remember her at a place in Normandy called La Trappe. And in time, that little oratory to this woman who died on the White Ship became the founding house of the Trappist monastic movement. La Trappe became the Trappists. So I'm a narrative historian, Steve. I'm not an academic. I hopefully get all the facts lined up, and then I try and drive the story. And that's really my passion, is bringing these half-forgotten stories alive and saying, hey, we should all know about this. And it's quite a ride.
Well, look, there's so much in this book I want to get into, but I want to read. I mean, I'm going to tell the audience that this is one of the most richly rich description, richly written, beautifully written treatments of this account, and not only what led up to it in terms of the historic context, then the incident, but then the after effect we'll get to. But I just want to read just a little paragraph. It just intrigued me. It says, it's on page 215. It says, in October 1131, Louis the Fat suffered a family loss to rival that of Henry. 11 years earlier, 15-year-old Philip was riding fast through the Grève, a market area in the suburbs of Paris, when a black pig that had been foraging in a dung heap shot under the young king's horse, tripping it up. Philip was flung forward against a rock, and his horse rolled on him. breaking bones and sending him into a coma. The co-ruler of France died the next day without having regained consciousness. I mean, that is rich, detailed writing of something 900 years ago. Who helped you with this?
Well, I think actually, I mean, my background, you kindly mentioned, was in news, and I used to work for NBC News a long time ago. And I remember, there are various things that I was taught as a very young man in my 20s. One was by a veteran radio correspondent, fantastic guy. And he took me aside, and I think he realized I hadn't a clue what I was doing. And he gave me the wonderful guidance. He said, when you write a piece for the Today Show, which is what I was doing, you want one of three reactions. And that is, from your audience member, they must go, that's me. Hey, I wish that was me. And hey, I'm glad that's not me. So every time I'm building a picture, it's with that in mind, really, that this is something I want the reader to connect with. And then what you're really referring to is the source material. Right. And I've written a few books, but my previous three were on the English Civil War. And anyone who's familiar with civil wars, as I'm sure a lot of you.
I'm planning to go back and read all those books, and we can continue to do these book events for your old books too.
Fantastic. But we know you've had your civil war in the 1860s. We had ours in the 1640s. And the problem with civil wars, my previous three books, is the source material is so partisan. You've got one side or the other. It's rather like somebody once described to me a divorce. There are three truths in a divorce. There's what the husband said, what the wife said, and then there's the truth. And it's the same with the two sides in the Civil War. But this is a much more complicated time because 1100 years ago, I touched on this earlier, but the absolute zest with which people treated Christianity, it was their lifeblood, it was their hope, it was their meaning. They hadn't got science, they had what they believed in the Bible. And it's a very old-fashioned Bible. It's the Old Testament that they're dealing with. So all of my primary sources, there are 9 from this period, they're all men and one woman of God. And that is tricky because I pick what you just read comes from the various chroniclers who are monastic. And actually, in this particular case, it's interesting you chose that. I got some of the color and detail from a French churchman who was really more of an aristocrat than a churchman. He happened to be in the church, but he might as well have been a knight. He was a very worldly man, and he wrote about that. And I what I have to judge, writing about people 900 years ago, is what is prejudice relating to religion and what is true. And you get a feel for who was there and who wasn't there. So the person who wrote the details about the pig has to have been there. Equally, there's this fantastic chronicler called Orderic Vitalis.
I love Orderic. I don't know the guy, but you refer to him. I think I would have liked this guy. I mean, he was...
He had a tough time. I mean, I was sent to boarding school and resented that. But this guy had a much tougher gig because he was an Englishman from, his father was a Norman, but he was English. He grew up as a boy in England with an English mother. And then his father had this sort of vision from God that to save Orderic's life, he must be cut off from his family forever. And so he sent from northern England to northern France to be a monk forever. Hoping to save his soul for eternity. And he is such a crucial witness to all of these goings on because he was in Normandy, near to where the shipwreck took place, but he always had his ear cocked towards England. And because this great disaster happened to the English on Norman land, he was an incredible witness. And I'm convinced, I'll never be able to prove this, I'm convinced that he sat with the butcher who survived because the visuals of his description are so sharp and so interesting in every detail that they have to. I've read all his work, which is, some of it's quite turgid. It's about what a great abbot one of the abbots was. It's quite hard work. But when it comes to flashpoints like this, you realize when he's actually emotionally involved and has taken the trouble to be a witness, and this is one of those cases.
Well, I love the richness of this writing, but let me go back from it and just ask you a few little things that I was confused by. And you may have just answered it with regards to the role of the church, which I may not have understood as really, but William the Conqueror, which got all this going, conquered, had England, had Normandy, put it all together. He was illegitimate. And so Henry the First, I just want to tell everyone, and please mute everyone, folks, but Henry the First got the crappiest hand dealt to him when William the Conqueror died, right? So that's another really interesting element to the story. You know, crappiest, he got 5,000 coins or something, but then his two brothers, two surviving brothers, one became the Duke of Normandy, the other became the King of England, and then after that, so he transferred that. So I'm just interested in the fact that Henry was a pretty promiscuous guy. He had lots and lots of children, but as you said, William was the one legitimate eldest heir. But what was wrong with illegitimacy? Because William the Conqueror, whom they all revered in many ways, was himself illegitimate.
That's such a brilliant question, if I may say so. And it's so clever to have spotted that, because this was a time when all that changed. So up until the early 1070s, so after Hastings, you end up with this extraordinary case of William the Bastard, as William the Conqueror used to be known, manages to take the not only the dukedom of Normandy, but then he wins the kingdom of England. And that was just within the bounds of possibility then. And then there's a pope called Gregory who becomes pope in the 1070s. And he realizes, I would say it's a political decision, that for the popes to become relevant and powerful again and to have command of the princes and barons of Europe, they decide on various things. And one of them is the Crusades. They decide that they must go on fairly spurious reasons to go and rescue the Christians in the Holy Land. And that's a way, there are many other reasons for this, but one of the reasons that the Pope got behind the idea of a crusade was to impose papal authority. Another one was to look back at the Bible and see what really mattered in their interpretation. And one of them was marriage. So during the span of this book, from 1066 to 1120, it became impossible for somebody to be considered as an heir to the throne if they were illegitimate. And that's because of a shift in papal power.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. Let me ask you then about the succession. So just, this is not a plot spoiler, folks. William dies on that ship. We all know that. He goes down in the Titanic. But then the Game of Thrones part really again takes over. So you start with the sort of Game of Thrones, the competitive brothers. And, I'm going to have to ask you this one question first, which is, I suppose you're related to these folks, right? You've got to be somehow a descendant in one of your lines, given that you're the ninth Earl Spencer. And, I checked your Wikipedia page, of course, and your Viscount of a bunch of different things. So these must be, is it strange to be writing about your aunts? Is there any sort of difference for you knowing that these were your antecedents, if you will, and that you're genetically connected to this Game of Thrones?
Well, I can give you two answers to that. One is that probably half the people watching this are connected to Henry I, because he was 900 years ago and he had 24 children. So we're probably all cousins.
He was the Genghis Khan of England.
He was the Genghis Khan. I tell you what I like about him, though. So this is a period where a lot of royal and aristocratic men had mistresses or were passing through a village and impregnated someone, and they rode on. But what I quite like about Henry is that he was like, yeah, I did, and that must be my son or daughter, and he took ownership. It's quite sort of grown up for that period. People didn't do that. And then do I care in terms of when I'm writing a history book, do I care that I'm related? Absolutely not. I mean, I really try to be even-handed. So even with the Civil War, the English Civil War is a very complex religious, social, political dynamic. and I had family on both sides in that war. And I try not to get involved in. I certainly don't take sides because it's not fair to the reader. So when I write these books, I was at Oxford, and I had as a roommate a very nice guy called Andrew. And Andrew is highly intelligent. He did very well at Merrill Lynch, and but essentially he's just a nice guy who's bright. And when I think of a book, I think, would Andrew read it? And Andrew is not interested in my family tree. So I want him, when he's going to Heathrow, he's going to desperately trying to seek some sunshine and flee England for a couple of weeks in the summer. I want him to pick my book up from the bookstore in Heathrow Airport before he goes on his summer holiday. So that's who I'm aiming at.
Oh,
and if
great.
I wrote about my ancestors in a favorable way, he would not pick it up.
Well, one of the other things that really struck me, I want to go back to the time and, my feeling of delight of not being born as a 12th century prince, because, your life might have been very short. People would have been after you, you have all sorts of responsibilities. You didn't know if you're going to hold your castle and all this. But I was intrigued by the times. I want to kind of take people and our viewers back. And, folks, we're going to take a few questions. But, if you go into the chat section of this and you can post your questions, I'll take some of them and pose them to Charles, because I want this to be your event as well. But I think that what interested in me was the fact that when Stephen, when Henry dies, then you got another Game of Thrones essentially at trying to succeed him, and he has a daughter. I think it's Matilda. Am I
That's
Matilda?
correct.
And there are lots of Matildas running around, by the way. That was a interesting challenge for me to follow, but I kind of drew a diagram. But so there's Matilda, Henry's daughter, and then his nephew, who was to go back to the White Ship. Excuse this, folks, but he got diarrhea, and so he didn't get on the ship. So diarrhea saved him from the cataclysm that took so many other of his family members and the royals of that time. And so the nephew came out, and this nephew turned out to be a nice guy as a ruler. And you write about it, or maybe the chroniclers of the time write about it so disdainfully that he was not as ruthless as others. He was not, people who was, he was not blinding his enemies and rebels. So I'm just sort of interested in that time that awful ruthlessness and brutality was somehow revered.
Yes. So essentially what people wanted, it didn't matter whether you lived in a monastery or in a village or in a field, you wanted peace. That was the prime requisite. And so therefore, out of that, your duty as a ruler was twofold. One was to have an undisputed heir, so there could be no dispute over the succession. And the other one was to be really hard on wrongdoers. So Henry I, my Russell Crowe figure in this, he took a very hard line on criminals, and people celebrated the fact that he had hanged 50 wrongdoers at a time. But he was a monster as well. I mean, truly a monster. He found all of the royal family at this time, the Duke of Normandy and his sons and grandsons, their happiest moments were hunting deer and wild boar. And so they made the hunting forests of England into royal reserves, and you could not do anything there. Terrible things. So for instance, if you had dogs and you lived there as a villager, you had to have your dogs mutilated so they couldn't chase the game. And even more terrifying, really, Henry I came across some men and women who were chopping timber just to keep themselves warm, going to burn it. And they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So he had their hands and feet cut off. I mean, really monstrous. But what they liked about him at this time was not the sheer violence of that, but the fact that the saying was that during Henry I's time, a young girl with a purse full of gold could walk from one end of the country to the other without being molested. That was the gold standard of responsible medieval rulership. And I put that down, Steve. I think what I worked that out while I was writing this. Obviously, there was no police force. The army, such as it was really the royal household. So when you got an opportunity to strike terror into your possible wrongdoers or your enemies, you grasped it and you really made an example of them. But I'm going to make everyone on this broadcast really upset with Henry I because this is indefensible. He was such a stickler for doing the right thing. What he did, which was understandable at the time and normal, he married his illegitimate children off to advantageous alliances around Europe. And he had one illegitimate daughter called Joanna, and he made her marry an aristocrat in Normandy. And she was having warfare, really, with the neighbors. So Henry, to bring peace to the area, made his daughter swap her two daughters, so his granddaughters, with the neighbor, and she took the neighbor's son as hostages to calm it all down. Joanna lost her temper and had the little boy blinded. The father of the little boy then went to Henry I and said, you know the rules, they're your rules. She's blinded my son, so I have to be able to blind your granddaughters. And unbelievably, Henry I agreed that not only could his two young granddaughters be blinded in retribution, but because they were on the wrong side of the argument, they had their noses cut off too. So, I mean, this is beyond Game of Thrones, really. It's so unimaginable. And you think, how on earth can such a man have been popular? Well, it was because there was England was totally peaceful during his reign of 35 years. And that was so unique. And well, it was totally unique. It's not so unique. You can't have a so unique. It was totally unique. And people appreciated that, even though it was done through sheer cruelty.
I do want to get to our questions in a second, but another thing that really intrigued me that you brought out, it was sort of peppered through the discussion of many of the battles between the brothers who were, on different sides of the channel and others, was the chivalric code that if someone ran out of water, they were provided water. If a rival's horse was shot out from beneath them, then the person he was fighting would give him another horse and send him away. I mean, these were interesting moments, and they just sort of caught me, and I had to go back and reread them because I said, wait, didn't he just give his enemy a horse to escape? Or, in the case of Matilda, I think it was King Stephen, who allowed her safe passage through the country to go and unite with someone. So there were these weird moments where rivalry and conflict were kind of sewn in with this magnanimity of sorts.
Yes, you're so right. And it's nonsensical to us. Why besiege somebody and when they run out of water, why give them water? I mean, that's the whole point, is to bring them to their knees. And I would say all of those examples you gave were mystifying to some people at the time. So they weren't normal. The reason they were written about was because people thought, what on earth is going on here? Cruelty was the norm. And you've mentioned King Stephen. King Stephen was the nephew of Henry I. As you mentioned, he didn't get on the white ship because he had diarrhea, and he seizes the throne. When he becomes king, after Henry I's death, people are quite happy to have him as king because essentially he's a good soldier and a nice and popular man, but he's too weak. And people turn their back on him because he's too nice. And when he captures castles, he doesn't kill or blind or castrate the people inside. And the lords are thinking, well, how on earth, there's an essential power in this whole story, which is the strength of the aristocrats, because most of them had estates in Normandy and in England, and they desperately didn't want to lose either. They wanted the king to be strong and not to put themselves in jeopardy. Very selfish. The kings were often secondary to the barons and their demands. So I think that chivalry would be a code that came in later, but you're absolutely right. There are flashes of strange behavior, which probably the people thought at the time was noble, but most people thought this is very weak and we don't respect you anymore, and we're going to look for an alternative leader.
Look, let's start taking some of these questions, some great questions from the audience. Robert Blecker, who's one of our great economists in Washington, but he told me he's secretly really fascinated in historian buff. But Robert asked, I thought I had read that the ship set sail on that fateful night during a bad storm, but you seem to suggest that weather was not a factor. What can you tell us about that? And Michael Feldman also asks, as a sailor, I was wondering if the weather on that November 25th contributed to the White Ship disaster, as described in the BBC podcast, by lulling the crew into a false sense of security. And I remember in your book, you talked about the weather being terrific and being a wonderful night to sail.
Yes, the weather was perfect. The royal party had been waiting for the wind to be pointing north to fill their sails to go from Barfleur to Southampton. Southampton on the south coast of England would normally be 10 or 12 hours. Everything was perfect. The wind was just the right strength to fill sails without being a problem. The sea was still. And it's all down to alcohol and helmsman's error, I'm afraid. There was no reason for the ship to go down otherwise. And that is the combination. And in fact, the weather was so calm that when the White Ship hit the Keyberth Rock, which is only a mile offshore, the people who were still awake in Barfleur heard the screams, but they got that wrong. They thought the screams they heard was this sort of party vessel reaching a new
height. The drinking had continued.
That's it. So no one took it seriously. They remembered the sound. It's tragic when you think about it. They heard the sound, but they didn't realize it was a cry for help.
Well, I mean, what happened with the cap? It's just, I read this and I read that the prince said, "Oh, let's bring wine on for everybody." But the notion that those running the ship, the captain of the ship, the sailors of the ship, the oarsmen, all of those, the guys that are supposed to keep, what was there no class separation? I mean, how did they get drunk too?
Mm. Well, that's interesting. So we know this from the people on shore because they were asked what happened. Mm. And essentially the prince was so flattered. He was like a rock star, and the crew was so thrilled to have him on board. They flattered him. And his payback to the crew was, "Hey, come on, guys, you're being so kind to me, but you must join in the fun too." This is a 17-year-old boy, in charge of the alcohol. That never really ends very well. And nobody was going to disobey him. You've got to realize life expectancy at this time was very short. 38 was the average. The king was 52. He could have died of natural causes at any time. And this young boy was set to be king. So nobody was going to say, "Hey, don't be silly, just keep that away from the crew." We know the crew were very drunk. There was some Marines on board, sort of, sailors. What do you know what Marines are? Sorry. But they were armed sailors. And they were so drunk before the ship set sail that some of the onlookers in port were absolutely horrified to see them lolling around in the best seats on the boat because they had become such a part of the party. So you have to deal with the immaturity of the prince at the center of this and his wanting to be popular and his gratification at being so flattered.
I like this question here from Alex Jurgen, and he says, did the royal family think of themselves as English or Norman or French or something else? Did these distinctions exist back then? What language did they speak?
Well, I'll have to, it's a brilliant question. I'm going to have to unpick it slightly. Mm-hmm. So we think of England before Hastings as purely Anglo-Saxon, but it wasn't. It already had strong Norman influence. So Edward the Confessor, who was the long-term king of England before 1066, there was, of course, Harold who died at Hastings, but the long-term one before, Edward the Confessor was essentially half Norman. His family had been exiled from England, and he was a second cousin of William the Conqueror. And he had spent many years in Normandy. And when he became king, he brought over a lot of Norman influence. William the Conqueror was purely Norman speaking. He tried to learn English. He was not a particularly cerebral man, and he found it very difficult. And he had other things to do. He had conquering on his mind. And he gave up learning English. The eldest son of William the Conqueror was interested in languages. We know after he lost the dukedom of Normandy, he was kept as a prisoner. He learned Welsh, which is an incredibly difficult language. Henry I, who's the main guy here, he could speak a little English. He could read Latin and what we would call French, but it's an old French. He couldn't write. But essentially, a lot of the writing, formal writing, would have been, so such as laws, etc., would have been in Latin, and the families split quite quickly. So you'd have some of a grand family in England maintaining their estates there, and others in Normandy. And within a couple of generations, you'd have had a more of an integrated Anglo-Norman language in England, and Norman, which is very close to French, remaining in Normandy.
Dr. Deborah Girasak asked, was it challenging for you to decipher the original source languages from that period? Which is a great question.
Yeah, incredibly so. I mean, I studied French up until 18 as one of my 3 subjects, which we do in England, called A-level. And then when I was at Oxford, you have to do one of your history papers in a foreign language, completely in a foreign language. And I did that in French. The French I know was a pale imitation of what I needed for this. And so I admitted surrender, and I found an incredibly able academic at Cambridge, very difficult for an Oxford man to do, but I did it. And she helped me with the more difficult language. And in fact, there's still some of it which even she couldn't crack. So I had to sort of either leave it out or be honest about things I wasn't quite sure about. So yeah, complicated stuff. It's and yeah, I got to be completely candid. I did rely on printed translations of the source material too, because otherwise I'd be writing this in 10 years' time.
So, another interesting thing, because I like this book, and I like how you framed it as how history would have changed and how it affected essentially the course of British history. Now, to again explain to our audience, Matilda, the son of Henry, and Stephen, the nephew of Henry, battled it out, and in the end, her son, who became Henry II, prevailed. And we all know him as Peter O'Toole in the Iron in Winter, the Lion in Winter, with I think it was Katharine Hepburn as Eleanor of Aquitaine, right? So I mean, I remember that Henry II, and essentially he became the first Plantagenet king, which then lasted for a long time. Now, I don't know the lines like you do, and we do know that this all ended with Richard III finally being killed by the Tudors. So in that line, what do you suspect, even though this 17-year-old boy died in the icy waters on November 25th, 1120, how would your family line have changed?
Well, I think the history of Europe would have changed very dramatically. So what happened was the Plantagenets were they were from another section of what we call France, because France wasn't France. When we talk of the King of France, he was only really the king of the Ile-de-France, which is a county around Paris. Yeah. And then he was notional overlord of what we would otherwise recognize as France and Belgium.
Totally inflated status, given how little land they had, right?
Yeah, I know. Who does he think he was? But the essential thing here was the Angevins, so the people from Anjou, were their rulers were the Plantagenets. And this got into an extraordinary, they got in a lucky run, because Henry II, yes, Henry I's grandson, he managed to scoop the pool in 1154. There was a compromise between the warring factions. Matilda, who, as he correctly said, was Henry I's only legitimate child who left standing, and Stephen, the nephew who seized the throne. England reached an impasse where there were just 2 sections of the country locked in a bloody civil war. The chroniclers say it was the period when blood descended on the land. And so to bring this to an end, the church and the aristocracy brought about a solution, which was that Stephen could remain as this rather ineffectual king until he died, but his children couldn't take over. Meanwhile, Matilda could remain as a woman of religion in France, but her eldest son, Henry Plantagenet, would become the king, Henry II. And the Plantagenets brought with them an awful lot of baggage, good and bad. They had their own dynastic interests. And then Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was this incredible heiress. She essentially was in charge of a third of France. If I can cut to the bottom line of what I'm chuntering on about, if the White Ship hadn't sunk, and if, it's not a given, because he could have tripped over a pig in a market, if William had gone on to have children of his own and have a line, then I think that the main two things would be that Britain would have remained what we are now today, a rather second-rate nation in the North Sea, disconnected from Europe, with power a distant memory. And at the same time, you would end up with us. We wouldn't have got involved in the 100 Years' War, which brought us into conflict with France for 100 years and brought us into alliances with other parts of Europe. And equally, for those of a religious interest who are watching us tonight, we would probably have got the Reformation a lot earlier than Henry VIII. Not that Henry VIII would have existed, of course, because he would have been... but
wrong line.
The wrong line. But what would have happened would be that we would have become rather like the Scandinavian countries or whatever. We would have got Calvinism or Lutheranism quite early on.
We've got a few minutes, folks, so feel free to continue to post questions in the chat section. But let me ask you kind of a weird question. You're sort of into pop culture. You're a pop culture guy in a sense, that famous sister tragedy, Diana, uncle to a future king, uncle to the brother of a future king who has gone a different path. You live in your home that you're sitting in right now is allegedly the inspiration for Bridgerton. You're talking. You're in the mix of all of this. You're in the mix of all of this. I'm just interested in what your insights into history. I know that brothers may not be killing each other, but how different is it today in terms of the dynamics of royal families, the church, the rivalries, the courtiers? I'm just interested if you have thought about this, that you sit amidst all of this and you've been a player in it. But do you ever transport yourself and back and say, if I had been Stephen, I would have done this, or I would have done, because
I might, out of safety, I might turn the question around a bit, which is
sure.
What it's made me realize was having had a sister who was one of the most famous people in the world while she was in her pomp. I realized the very human side of people. So we can look back and say Henry VIII, let's choose him because he's the most famous monarch that England's ever had. And we think of him as this, psychopath, kills his wives, that sort of thing. But it's made me realize how human these people are. I always try and look for the humanity in the people I write about or am interested in. You in your job will have met incredibly famous people, and often you think, oh, is that it? Sort of thing. And equally, you can meet the most humble people. I recently met this poor lady who lost her daughter in terrible circumstances, a terrible crime. And she was of very limited education, whatever, but she had greatness. There was greatness there. So it teaches you to judge people on their individual merit rather than their status. I'm quite, it's funny, I'm sitting in this incredibly glorious, stately home and all of that in England, but I'm actually very, liberal at heart, really. I always think, who would I most want to have had dinner with out of all of history? And it's not Julius Caesar or Cleopatra, it's Thomas Paine. What an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
So it's about people and ideas. That's what attracts me, not bloodlines, which of course sounds ridiculous because I wouldn't have what's around me unless I had bloodlines. But I sort of cut through that. I'm too old to be impressed by all this stuff.
Well, it's not in being impressed. It's the question of the dynamics. But I really appreciate your candor on that. But there is an interesting question here from Munib Kadir. He says, in 2021, when there have been changes introduced to rules of succession to the British throne with lesser emphasis on having a male heir, do you think that the institution of monarchy has evolved from the 12th century, or are there still parallels to be drawn? And I want to piggyback on this because part of the book deals with the fact that, if I get all this right, Henry I actually had built around for his legitimate daughter, Matilda, to succeed him, and that the lords around him. So there was going to be a female, there was going to be a queen. And I thought you dealt beautifully with the misogyny of that time. And I'm just interested, so to go to Munib's question about this, does it descend, but also to talk about Matilda's fate, because she sort of got screwed in the process, right?
Yeah, there are two sides to the misogyny, as you call it, which is the correct word. In no way am I defending the first, but we have to understand it. Yeah. So to the medieval mind, the ruler had to be able to lead an army into battle. And it just was impossible for your average knight or baron to think that they could follow a woman into battle. So that, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying that was the case, because you can read the literature on that from the time. Even when they really admired a great lady, they made it, well, of course, she can never be our ruler because. And then on the second point, which is much more upsetting to the modern mind, was the dual standards that were applied to women at this time. So Matilda, Henry's surviving legitimate child, was a woman of enormous ability, proven ability. She had been married to the Holy Roman Emperor, the most important ruler in Europe. She had discharged duties on his behalf, both legal and political, with great aplomb. She was very much William the Conqueror's granddaughter. She showed all the qualities of the conqueror and the conqueror's sons, and that ruled her out of possibly being the ruler, because that, in the misogynistic mind of the early 12th century, made her not ladylike, and that was a real problem. So she's within touching distance of becoming queen in the early 1140s. She's preparing for her coronation in London when a crowd of rebels rise up and come storming through her palace, and she has to flee. And the chroniclers justify this is because they basically said she's too strong, she's too overbearing. Well, as I've already explained, you wanted strong and overbearing. She would have been a very good monarch from our point of view, I think. But she was unacceptable because she was a woman.
You know, we've got a couple of other good questions we're going to, but there's one interesting question that I, again, trying to transport myself back to that time. One of the data points you put in the book is the population of England at that time was about 1.3 million people. And then in one of these devastating episodes, and I've forgotten which, who was the provocateur, but 100,000 people were killed. So it reduced the population by about 8%. And you sort of saw this. But then when you saw talk of the King's Forest and the hunting and all of this, it just, the density, I mean, I just can't figure out how people would even see someone gathering wood in the forest or hunting a boar. Yes. Because, it's not like today where you walk out on the street. I mean, 1.3 million people on all of England is not very dense.
You're so right. So yes, that devastation happened soon after William the Conqueror won at the Battle of Hastings. We often think that was it. It was settled. He had won. But England was a very rich prize at this time. It had huge agricultural wealth, a thriving economy, good exports, etc. And a lot of people from overseas were looking at England and wanting it. And so William the Conqueror was very nervous about Scandinavians coming to the northeast of England. So he sent troops to devastate it. And yes, 100,000 people died. They didn't all get put to the sword at all, but the land was made uninhabitable. because William didn't want an invading army to have a foothold. If they arrived, they would starve. And the devastation was still visible to the historians 50 years later. And then the population thing, you're right. I mean, it's so unimaginable to think how small it was. I mean, I've written about England even 500 years after this. There were only 3 centres in England with a population of 10,000 people. Of course, London was huge, but there are only 2 other cities with 10,000 people. And you just think, my God, you're dealing with such tiny populations. And so the devastation, in these battles, these pitched battles where 1,000 or whatever people died, it doesn't sound very much by our standards, but it was huge. If you think you've lost 0.1 of your population in an afternoon skirmish, it's a lot.
It's fascinating. A couple of other quickies. Does the butcher, I love this from Deborah Girasek, does the butcher have an interesting after story?
Well, the butcher lived for about 20 years, and he had a sort of rather dark celebrity status. But again, in this religious time, people thought, well, he must be blessed by God. How else would he be the sole survivor? Well, I can tell you he's the sole survivor because he was wearing the right clothes. He was wearing the offcuts of his trade. He was wearing goatskin and sheepskin.
I mean, I just want to remind people he was there because he was chasing down people who owed him money, right?
Yes. So he had right on his side. And yeah, he was well known in the area as being the man who survived. He was the equivalent of, say, there had been one survivor of the Titanic. I mean, actually, to touch on that, people say, when I say, it's the worst disaster Britain's ever had at sea, it's because it changed the dynasty. It's because of the huge impact. It's not that obviously more people died in other disasters, but no, it's this man had a status that was huge. People would point. I'm imagining now. People would point at him and say he's the one who survived the White Ship.
And finally, I'm asked, have you sold the TV rights and movie rights? Is there going to be a film or TV adaptation of The White Ship? Maybe not with Peter O'Toole, but with Russell Crowe.
I have to say, I mean, I hope this isn't... Peter O'Toole was a great friend of mine, and he used to have his weekend cottage literally 400 yards from where I'm sitting. He used to come and play cricket here as an old man, a sweet, sweet guy. But I haven't yet. I've had some people interested. Hollywood's a funny old place. I have actually my last book. I've just sold the TV rights for a TV series to that, and that's about something completely different. But I mean, who knows? And I don't ever look that far ahead. I find what I think is a gripping story and try and present it to people and see if they find it interesting. And that's what I do. I'm not very commercial. I'm a storyteller, who deals in facts, and that's really my brief.
Well, I have to say I love the book. I hope you'll let me interview you again on your next book and your older books. This was really, really fun. Charles Spencer, thank you very, very much for sharing.
Well, I can say,
sharing your work
Steve,
with us, and congratulations on the launch.
We are very kind, and I can honestly say this book's been out for a year now, and that was the most interesting interview, and you were the best interviewer I've had in that time. So thank you.
Well, we're very, very grateful for your time, and thank you. And I really look forward to the next one. So thank you so much. I want to thank our audience for your questions. Thank you so much for joining us for this. I hope you'll come back for others. I like doing this. This is a way for me to keep up with the world, but I am definitely glad I was not a 12th century prince. And so we'll just leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.